Lucas Black didn't believe one small act could change a life, until a quiet little girl handed him a handmade necklace and refused to let the world ignore her. The summer sun was beginning to set over New York City, casting a warm golden hue across the windows of the upscale restaurant on 47th Street. Inside, waiters in black uniforms moved briskly between tables, balancing polished trays and murmuring in low, professional tones. The hum of soft piano music floated beneath the quiet clink of silverware. It was a place where reservations were booked weeks in advance and a simple dinner could cost more than a working family's rent. That evening, the last thing anyone expected to see was a small girl walking in alone. She was no older than 8, wearing a white cotton dress that looked like it had once been elegant, but now bore faint stains at the hem. Her blonde hair was loosely braided, strands falling into her brown eyes, and her worn sneakers squeaked against the polished floor. The maitre d' at the front desk blinked in surprise, momentarily unsure whether to stop her or call someone, but the girl moved with quiet confidence, as if she belonged there. She found an empty table by the window and carefully pulled out the chair, sitting down without saying a word. A few diners cast curious glances, but no one said anything. Perhaps they assumed she was waiting for an adult, or perhaps they simply didn't want to get involved. A waiter approached cautiously, expecting her to run or stammer, but instead she looked up at him and politely said, "Can I have the soup of the day and toast, please?" Her voice was calm, steady. He hesitated, then nodded, mumbling something about confirming with the kitchen, before disappearing behind the bar. In the corner of the room, Lucas Black, a tall man with dark brown hair and sharp eyes that rarely missed a detail, had been reviewing notes on his phone. As CEO of one of the country's leading biotech firms, Lucas was used to operating at full speed, flashing between cities, meetings, deadlines, but that evening he'd come for silence. And yet, the presence of the girl caught his attention. She sat there, hands folded in her lap, her eyes tracing the light patterns on the tablecloth. When the soup arrived, she thanked the waiter and began eating slowly, savoring each spoonful as though it was her first warm meal in days. The toast she broke into tiny pieces, chewing quietly and wiping her mouth with perfect manners. It wasn't until the bill arrived that everything changed. The waiter, now more confused than ever, placed the check beside her. She glanced at it, then lowered her eyes and said, "I'm sorry. I don't have money." Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't beg or cry. She simply stated it, as though it were an unavoidable fact of her world. The restaurant manager appeared a moment later, motioning for security. A tall man in a black suit began to approach. From his corner, Lucas put his phone down and stood. Something about the girl, her composure, her dignity, her isolation, tugged at something deep inside him. Before security could reach her, he crossed the room and said firmly, "That won't be necessary." Everyone paused. Lucas looked at the girl and then turned to the staff. "Her meal is on me." The guard hesitated, then stepped back. The manager mumbled something about house policy, but Lucas gave him a look that silenced further protest. He knelt beside the girl's table, studying her face. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lily," she replied. "Are you here by yourself?" She nodded. "Where are your parents?" There was a pause, then she said softly, "I don't have any." Lucas exhaled, staring at the nearly empty bowl in front of her. "Are you hungry?" She gave the smallest nod. "Would you like dessert?" She looked uncertain, as if unsure if he was mocking her, but then nodded again. Lucas signaled for a slice of cake. While they waited, he didn't ask more questions. He just sat there, beside her, in a restaurant full of polished glass and quiet judgment. And in that moment, the world outside, of mergers, investors, and numbers, faded into the background. There was only this girl, who had walked into the heart of luxury with nothing but her courage, and somehow reminded him what it meant to be human. Later that evening, long after the restaurant had quieted down and the tables were being cleared for the night, Lucas found himself doing something he hadn't planned. He stood outside on the sidewalk next to Lily, unsure of what the next step should be. The girl held the takeout box he had asked the staff to pack for her, half of her chocolate cake, carefully wrapped, as if it were something precious. She didn't say much, but she stayed close to him, clearly not wanting to return to wherever she had come from. It was then that he finally asked, "Where do you live?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Nowhere." He stared at her, momentarily at a loss. He'd met hundreds of executives, dealt with crises and corporate disasters, yet here, in front of a small child with nothing but a worn dress and old sneakers, he was speechless. The way she said it, so certain, without sadness or drama, hit him harder than any boardroom accusation ever had. "Do you have anyone?" he asked. "No," she replied. "I used to, but not anymore." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. He simply nodded, trying to absorb the weight of her words. A taxi pulled up beside them, and the driver looked expectantly at Lucas. For a moment he considered putting her in the car, sending her to a shelter or a hospital. But something about that felt wrong, like passing responsibility instead of accepting it. He couldn't shake the image of her sitting at that white-clothed table, eating soup with perfect manners, not begging, not complaining. She had dignity. More than many adults he knew. Finally, he looked down at her and said, "You'll come with me tonight." Lily didn't react the way he expected. She didn't jump with excitement or ask where they were going. She simply nodded once, calmly, as though she had learned long ago not to expect anything good, and to never get too attached. They rode together in silence to his apartment building, a sleek, high-rise in Midtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a private elevator. The doorman greeted Lucas with a familiar nod, but blinked in surprise when he saw the small girl walking beside him. Lucas offered no explanation. He wasn't sure he could give one yet. Upstairs, the apartment was quiet and pristine, designed in neutral colors, all clean lines and expensive simplicity. Lily walked in and immediately took off her shoes, leaving them by the door. She didn't ask where to sit or what she was allowed to touch. She simply stood near the wall, her eyes scanning the room, taking it all in like someone who had entered a different world. Lucas brought her a glass of water and set it on the kitchen island. "You can stay in the guest room," he said. "It's down the hall. There are fresh towels and blankets. If you need anything, just ask." She nodded again. Then, without a word, she walked down the hallway, carrying the cake box with her like it was treasure. When Lucas checked on her 10 minutes later, she was curled up on top of the neatly made bed, still fully dressed, clutching the box in her arms. Her eyes were closed, but her face remained tense, like she wasn't sure if she'd be allowed to stay until morning. He didn't try to wake her. Instead, he closed the door gently and stood outside the room for a long moment, his thoughts racing. What was he doing? He wasn't a parent. He didn't have time, or experience, or any clue how to care for a child. But none of that seemed to matter when he looked at her. For the first time in years, something in his life didn't come down to logic or benefit. It came down to instinct. And his instincts were screaming not to let her go. That night, Lucas didn't sleep well. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the people who had likely seen Lily and chosen to look away. He wondered how many nights she had slept on concrete, how many times she'd been turned away, and how much it must have taken for her to walk into that restaurant alone. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky with pale light, he rose quietly and checked the guest room. She was still asleep, curled up like a kitten, the cake box now sitting neatly on the nightstand. He stood in the doorway and realized that whatever this was, whatever it became, it had already begun. The next morning, the apartment was quiet. Sunlight filtered in through the large windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. Lucas stood in the kitchen making coffee, his movements unusually slow and deliberate. He kept glancing toward the hallway, half expecting to hear the guest room door creak open, but it remained closed. He had left a clean t-shirt and some folded sweatpants on the dresser the night before, not knowing if she'd even be comfortable enough to use them. Everything about the situation was unfamiliar to him, foreign territory in a life otherwise built on precision and control. Eventually, he heard soft footsteps. Lily appeared in the hallway, still wearing her white dress but barefoot now, her hair a little tangled. She stood near the kitchen, hesitant but not afraid. Lucas turned and gave a slight nod. "Good morning," he said. She looked up at him and gave a small nod in return. He motioned toward the table where he had laid out toast, scrambled eggs, and a bowl of fruit. "You can eat whatever you like." She approached slowly and sat down, quiet as ever. He watched as she picked up a piece of toast and began to eat with the same slow, careful movements he remembered from the restaurant. He didn't push her to talk. Instead, he sat across from her and read the news on his tablet, giving her space. After a few minutes, she looked up and asked softly, "Do you have to go to work?" He paused for a second, surprised. "Not today," he answered. "I can stay." She seemed relieved, though she said nothing. After breakfast, she helped clear the plates without being asked. Lucas offered her a brush for her hair, and she took it with a quiet, "Thank you," before disappearing down the hall to use the bathroom. He sat on the edge of the couch, trying to piece together how easily she moved in this space, like she had done it before, maybe in dozens of unfamiliar places, never knowing how long she'd be allowed to stay. Later in the morning, Lucas sat down beside her on the living room rug with a notebook and a pen. "Can I ask you some questions?" he said gently. She hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Do you remember your parents?" he asked. "My mom," she said, her voice small but steady. "She died in a car accident 2 years ago." "And your dad?" She shook her head. "He left when I was a baby." Lucas paused, heart tightening. "Did you live with someone after that?" "Foster homes," she replied. "I stayed in 3. The last one was," she trailed off, staring at the carpet. He didn't push her to finish. "Instead," he said, "and then you ran away." She nodded again. "I just wanted quiet. And food." Lucas felt something shift in him. He wasn't a man driven by sentiment, but there was something deeply unsettling about hearing a child speak in such a resigned tone, as if she no longer expected kindness from the world. "Have you told anyone else where you are?" he asked. "No," she said. "I didn't think I'd stay here." She looked up, eyes cautious. "Am I allowed to?" Lucas met her gaze, unwavering. "As long as you want," he said. "But we'll need to let someone know eventually. The law requires it." She didn't argue. She just lowered her head and whispered, "Okay." That afternoon, Lucas called his lawyer. Not because he had made any decision yet, but because he needed information. He needed to understand what it would take to make things safe, for her, and for him. While the call took place in his home office, Lily sat in the guest room drawing quietly with colored pencils he'd found in a drawer. He peeked in once and saw a picture of a house with a garden and 3 windows. One of them had a tiny blonde figure peeking out. He said nothing, just watched her for a moment before returning to his call. That night, when it was time for bed, she asked shyly if she could keep the hallway light on. He nodded. She lay under the blanket in clean pajamas, clutching the same beaded necklace she had given him the night before, now hanging from her wrist like a bracelet. As he stood in the doorway, about to say goodnight, she spoke without looking at him. "Thank you for not asking me to leave." Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat. "You're safe here, Lily," he said. "You don't have to run anymore." She didn't respond, but she reached for the nightstand and gently placed the necklace there, as if to say she believed him, just enough to try sleeping without holding it close. For the first time in a long time, she drifted off without fear, while Lucas sat awake in the living room, staring at the necklace, knowing this was no longer about charity or impulse. It was the beginning of something much more permanent than he'd ever expected. The following days unfolded in a strange balance of routine and quiet transformation. Lucas found himself waking earlier than usual, not to check stock reports or reply to emails, but to see if Lily had slept through the night. Most mornings she had, though sometimes he'd find her already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the guest room, sketching shapes and houses in the margins of a notebook. She still spoke little, but the way she moved had shifted, less guarded, a bit more steady, like her feet were starting to believe they had a place to land. Lucas had taken time away from work under the excuse of handling personal matters, which was true in a way he hadn't expected to explain to anyone. He spent his days slowly building trust between them, creating small anchors of safety she could hold on to. He let her choose her meals. He brought her to the bookstore and let her pick out any 3 books she wanted. He gave her space when she needed it and gently encouraged her to speak when she was ready. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And he found himself caring in a way that frightened him, because it meant he could lose something again. One afternoon, while she was in the living room quietly reading, Lucas received a call from his lawyer. The private investigator he had discreetly hired had traced Lily's records. Her mother, Emily Marks, had died in a confirmed accident almost 2 years ago. Her father was legally listed as unknown. Lily had bounced between foster care placements and had indeed disappeared from the last one 3 months earlier. There was no active search for her. No one had filed a report. No one had noticed. Lucas sat at his desk in silence, the weight of that realization pressing down on him like a stone. She hadn't been kidnapped. She hadn't been stolen. She had simply vanished, and the world had carried on. She was a child who had slipped through every crack. That night, he sat down with her after dinner and gently explained what he had learned. He didn't push, just shared the facts. Lily listened quietly, her fork still in her hand. When he finished, she looked at her plate for a long moment, then said, "I knew no one was looking. That's why I left." He nodded, his voice low. "That shouldn't have happened. I didn't want to be part of someone's money," she added. "Sometimes they only took me in because they got paid for it. But no one really wanted me." Lucas took a deep breath and looked at her. "I'm not taking care of you for money, Lily. And I didn't ask for this to happen. But now that it has, I don't want you to go back to that kind of life." Her eyes didn't fill with tears. She was past that. But her lip trembled, and she looked away, gripping the edge of the table. "What if you change your mind?" "I won't," he said, without hesitation. "But even if I did, which I won't, you'd never go back to being invisible. I'll make sure of it." The next morning, Lucas contacted social services himself. He explained the situation, told them she was safe, and made it clear that he wanted to apply for legal guardianship. The initial response was skeptical, even cold. A businessman taking in a homeless child with no previous experience raised flags. But Lucas was calm and clear. He hired a family lawyer who specialized in emergency custody petitions, and within 48 hours, Lily's case was flagged as eligible for temporary protective placement. That weekend, a social worker came to visit the apartment. Lucas took the day off work and made sure everything was in order. Lily stayed close to him during the interview but answered the questions she was asked. When the social worker asked if she felt safe here, she simply said, "This is the first place where I don't count the exits before I sleep." That sentence seemed to linger in the air long after the woman had gone. Lucas stood in the hallway that night, listening to the hum of the dishwasher and the distant city noise, and tried to imagine what it would take for a child to measure the world by exits. He knew one thing for certain, that wouldn't be her future anymore. The next day, he framed the beaded necklace she had given him in a small shadow box and placed it on a shelf in his home office. Not as decoration. As a reminder. A symbol of what mattered more than anything else, the quiet, unexpected way love had entered his life, wrapped in a plastic string of beads and an act of thank you from someone the world had forgotten. The approval for temporary guardianship came faster than Lucas expected, and when it did, it brought with it a strange mix of relief and responsibility. There was no celebration, no applause, just a quiet envelope delivered by a courier, containing the official document that named him as the temporary guardian of Lily Marks. He sat at the kitchen counter that morning, rereading the letter, the legal language cold and impersonal, but the weight of it was deeply personal. He now had the right to care for her, to make decisions for her, to protect her. More than that, he had the chance to keep a promise he hadn't even realized he'd made the moment she walked into that restaurant. When Lily came into the room, freshly dressed in jeans and a pale blue t-shirt he had bought her during their quiet trip to a nearby department store, he showed her the document. He explained it carefully, in simple words. "It means I'm allowed to take care of you, for real. Not just as someone who let you stay over, but someone who's chosen to stay." She stared at the paper, her expression unreadable, then quietly asked, "How long does temporary mean?" Lucas didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt so they were eye level and said, "As long as it takes to make it permanent." Over the next few days, life settled into something resembling a rhythm. Mornings began with breakfast, usually toast, eggs, or oatmeal, and Lily started helping without being asked. She watered the plants, folded her laundry, and always asked before taking something from the fridge, even though Lucas kept telling her she didn't have to. She was still cautious, still careful, but there were moments now, small ones, when she would forget to be guarded. She began humming softly while drawing. She left her sketchbooks open on the table. She laughed, once, when Lucas burned the pancakes and tried to cover it with syrup. Lucas, for his part, was adjusting to the shift in his life like a man learning to walk on uneven ground. He kept up with work remotely but delegated more than usual. He found himself checking the clock at school dismissal time, even though Lily wasn't enrolled yet. He researched therapists who specialized in trauma and foster transitions, and after some gentle conversation, Lily agreed to speak with one. The first session was quiet. The second one ended with a half-smile. By the third, she drew a picture of herself sitting in a house with a dog, a tree, and someone she labeled, "Not leaving this time." The emotional weight of those words hit Lucas harder than he expected. He knew, logically, what she had been through, he'd read the reports, heard the stories. But nothing prepared him for the impact of seeing it spelled out in her own shaky handwriting. It made him more certain than ever that he was doing the right thing, even when the process ahead felt daunting. One evening, as they were both finishing dinner, Lily put her fork down and said, "I was scared to give you the necklace." Lucas looked up, surprised. "Why?" She shrugged. "Because I thought you'd think it was silly. Or ugly." He shook his head. "It's not ugly. It's the most important thing in this apartment." She smiled then, truly smiled, the kind that didn't hide behind politeness. "I made it for someone I didn't know I could trust yet." Lucas nodded. "And now?" She didn't answer. She just reached over and took his hand, holding it for a moment before going to clear her plate. Later that night, Lucas stood in his office looking at the framed necklace again. He remembered the moment she handed it to him, how small her fingers were, how unsure her eyes. And now, she was brushing her teeth in the hallway bathroom, folding towels without being told, planning to go to school again, asking questions about dogs and whether they could maybe, possibly get one someday. He didn't know what kind of father he was becoming, if he was becoming one at all, but he knew he was no longer just a man with a title and a penthouse. He was a man who had been handed a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. That night, Lily left her bedroom door cracked open for the first time. Lucas noticed it while walking past and didn't close it. He understood. It was her way of saying she no longer needed a barrier between her and the world. Or between her and him. She was still healing. He was still learning. But something unspoken had shifted, and neither of them wanted to go back to who they were before they met. A few weeks later, Lucas found himself walking into a quiet elementary school building for a meeting he never imagined having. The principal's office smelled faintly of coffee and old books, and the walls were lined with children's drawings and awards. He sat in a chair across from a guidance counselor named Mrs. Callahan, a kind-faced woman with silver hair and tired eyes, and explained Lily's situation carefully but firmly. He talked about the temporary guardianship, her previous circumstances, and his desire to enroll her in the coming school term. Mrs. Callahan listened attentively, asking questions with both professionalism and empathy, and by the end of the meeting, she promised to fast-track the paperwork. "She'll be placed gently," she said. "We'll make sure she feels safe." Lucas left the school feeling both anxious and relieved. It was one thing to care for Lily inside his carefully structured world, but the idea of sending her back into an environment filled with other children and unfamiliar adults brought a quiet, unsettling fear. Still, he knew she needed more than just protection. She needed a life, a childhood, something real that didn't revolve around fear and uncertainty. So he prepared her the best he could. They bought a backpack together. They picked out notebooks with bright covers and pencils with glitter erasers. Lily didn't say much during those shopping trips, but she held his hand the entire time. The night before her first day, Lucas helped her lay out clothes on the foot of the bed, a soft yellow sweater, dark jeans, and sneakers that didn't have holes in them. Lily sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the outfit like it was a costume she wasn't sure she had the right to wear. "You're going to do great," he told her. "Just be you." She looked at him, unsure. "What if they ask why I don't have a real family?" Lucas paused, then answered carefully. "You tell them the truth. You tell them you're with someone who chose to stay." The morning of school was quiet, full of unspoken nerves. She ate a small breakfast and hugged her sketchbook to her chest all the way there. Lucas walked her to the building's front steps, where a teacher was waiting to greet new students. When it came time to let go, Lily hesitated, then reached out and gave him a quick, tight hug. He didn't move for a long time after she disappeared inside. For the rest of the day, he kept checking his phone, even though he knew there would be no emergency calls. That evening, she came home and placed her backpack quietly by the door. Lucas looked at her, unsure of what to expect, but she said simply, "It was okay," and then she pulled out a drawing she had made during art class. It was of a tall building with glass walls and a tiny girl standing at the front door. She had labeled it, "Where I Started Over." That night, after dinner, she asked if she could keep the framed necklace in her room. Lucas hesitated for a moment, not because he minded, but because he realized what the request meant. He nodded. "Of course." Together they moved the frame, placing it carefully on her desk. She looked at it with a quiet kind of reverence, like it was more than just plastic beads. "That was the first thing I gave to anyone," she said softly. "Before that, I never gave anything away." Lucas didn't know what to say, so he just reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder. As the weeks passed, Lily began to change in small but noticeable ways. She spoke more freely. She started asking to help cook, even if it was just stirring soup. She left her room door open most nights. She got excited about school projects, especially anything involving drawing or storytelling. But there were still hard days, days when certain sounds or smells would send her into silence, or nights when she'd wake up from dreams she couldn't explain. Lucas never pushed. He would just sit beside her in the dark, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes saying nothing at all. One evening, after a particularly rough day at school when a classmate had said something careless about real families, Lily came home quiet and withdrawn. Lucas waited until after dinner, then asked gently if she wanted to talk. She shook her head at first, but then said, "He said people like me don't belong." Lucas felt a sharp heat in his chest, but he stayed calm. "People like you?" She nodded. "Kids who come from nowhere." He leaned forward and looked her straight in the eyes. "You don't come from nowhere. You come from survival. You come from strength. And you belong anywhere you decide to be." That night, she drew a picture of herself standing on a hill holding a flag. The word on the flag was just one word, "Here." Lucas taped it to the fridge, right above the grocery list. It stayed there long after the list changed. It stayed there as a reminder that no matter how long the road had been, Lily was finally standing where she deserved to be, and she was no longer invisible. As the months passed, Lily's presence in Lucas's home became not only normal but necessary. What began as a quiet coexistence had transformed into a bond that was strong, layered, and difficult to define in simple terms. She had carved out a place for herself without force, just by being who she was, thoughtful, observant, and resilient. Lucas often caught himself watching her with quiet awe, not because she was extraordinary in any showy way, but because she carried herself with a kind of wisdom he rarely saw in adults, let alone children. The girl who had once sat alone in a restaurant now belonged somewhere, and it showed in how she laughed, how she asked questions, how she dared to hope for things. They had started doing small weekend traditions, pancake breakfasts, bookshop visits, walks in the park. Lily developed a habit of collecting smooth stones and giving them names, keeping them lined up on her bedroom windowsill like quiet guardians. Lucas made space for them all without comment, but he knew what they were, her way of creating permanence in a world that had been constantly shifting. One Saturday morning, she asked if they could go somewhere special. Not a store, she clarified. Somewhere people don't go just because they want something. After thinking it over, Lucas took her to a quiet art museum tucked away on the Upper East Side. She spent 2 hours in the sculpture wing alone, staring at shapes and forms, saying almost nothing until she finally whispered, "These things stay. No matter what." That night, Lucas sat at his desk filling out the application to begin the process of permanent adoption. It was a thick file, full of background checks, financial disclosures, psychological readiness evaluations, but none of it made him pause. He had no doubts. As he filled in the forms, he realized he had been thinking of Lily as his daughter for a long time already, the paperwork was just catching up to reality. When he told her the next morning, she looked stunned for a few seconds, then quietly asked, "Are you sure?" He gave her the only answer that mattered. Absolutely. The process wasn't fast. There were still home visits, interviews, follow-ups. Lily met with a child advocate who asked her a series of structured questions, most of which she answered with quiet honesty. One, however, made her stop. "What do you think a family is?" the woman asked. Lily stared at the table for a long time before saying, "A family is someone who waits for you to come back, even when you're scared you might not." It wasn't poetic. It was raw and real. And it stayed with everyone who heard it. Lucas, meanwhile, was forced to confront parts of himself he had avoided for years. He attended parenting classes, sat through child development lectures, spoke with therapists about how trauma rewires trust. He didn't skip any of it. Not because the courts required it, but because he needed to know how to do this right. He had lost people before. He wasn't going to lose her. Sometimes, in moments of quiet, he found himself replaying the night she handed him the beaded necklace. How simple it had seemed. How life-altering it had become. One evening, Lily came home from school with an assignment, write about someone who changed your life. She didn't show it to him, but he found it later by accident while sorting through her school papers. It was only one page, written in careful, looping letters. "The person who changed my life is the man who didn't send me away. He didn't know who I was or what I'd been through. He didn't ask me to prove anything. He just gave me a place at the table and looked me in the eyes like I mattered. Now I know I do." Lucas read it twice before gently placing it back where he found it. He didn't bring it up. He didn't need to. Some things were better kept in quiet reverence. That night, when Lily came to say goodnight, she paused in his doorway and said, "I hope they say yes." He didn't ask who she meant. He simply stood and pulled her into a hug. "They will," he said. "And if they don't, we'll fight. Together." As he turned off the lights and headed back to his office, Lucas realized he had never fought for anything so fiercely, not his company, not his wealth, not even his own heart. But for Lily, he would. Without hesitation. Because this wasn't about saving someone anymore. This was about building something that neither of them had before. A home. A family. A future that wasn't based on survival, but on the radical, quiet act of staying. The day of the final court hearing arrived with quiet anticipation. Lucas had barely slept the night before, not out of fear that things would go wrong, but because the weight of what was about to happen pressed heavily on him in the most humbling way. He dressed in a simple navy suit, the same one he wore for board meetings, though today's agenda felt infinitely more important. Lily wore a soft blue dress they had picked together, a dress she had said made her feel like herself but neater. She held his hand on the drive downtown, silent, but without the anxious fidgeting she once had. Her trust was steady now, grounded in experience and choice, not just hope. The courthouse was quiet that morning, as if the city outside had hushed for a moment to honor what was about to unfold. They sat together in a long hallway waiting for their case to be called. Other families moved around them, some tense, some smiling, but Lily stayed close, occasionally tracing patterns on the wooden bench with her fingertip. Lucas didn't say much. He simply squeezed her hand now and then, and she didn't let go. When their names were called, they entered a bright courtroom with tall windows and pale light. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and a calm voice, smiled kindly as they approached. Lucas had seen her name on the documents but never met her in person. She looked at Lily first, then at him. What followed was a series of questions, formalities, and readings of statements. Lucas answered everything clearly, without hesitation. Yes, he was aware of the responsibilities. Yes, he intended to raise her as his own. Yes, he was prepared to provide her with emotional and financial support indefinitely. Lily was asked a few things too, and she replied in her quiet, steady voice, never once glancing at Lucas for help. When the judge asked why she wanted this to happen, Lily said, "Because he didn't choose me out of obligation. He chose me when he didn't have to." For a long moment, the judge said nothing. Then she looked over her glasses and gave a small, warm smile. "I believe that's the best reason of all." With a firm but gentle tone, she made the ruling official. The guardianship was no longer temporary. Lucas was now, in the eyes of the law and the heart of a child, Lily's father. There was no applause, no dramatic music, but the silence that followed felt sacred. Lily turned to look at Lucas and whispered, "We did it." He smiled, blinking away the sharp heat behind his eyes, and said, "Yes, we did." They left the courthouse slowly, not in a rush, walking as if the city had somehow shifted beneath their feet. The world looked the same, but for them, everything had changed. On the way home, they stopped at a small bakery and bought 2 slices of cake, chocolate for her, lemon for him. It wasn't a celebration in the traditional sense, but it felt perfect. That night, they sat together in the living room, sharing the dessert while flipping through a photo album Lucas had made for her. It started with a printed photo from the security camera of the restaurant the night they met. Lily laughed when she saw it. "I look so small," she said. "You still are," he teased, and she smiled. Later, when she went to bed, Lucas placed something new on her nightstand beside the framed necklace. It was a small, simple plaque that read, "Welcome home, Lily Black." She didn't notice it until the next morning. When she came into the kitchen holding it in her hands, she looked at him with wide eyes, then slowly nodded, understanding exactly what it meant. From that day on, they kept building a life together, ordinary days filled with school runs, messy breakfasts, and bedtime stories. There were still questions, still moments of reflection and healing, but the difference now was that neither of them faced it alone. Lucas never stopped thinking about the necklace, not because it was beautiful, but because it marked the moment a frightened little girl gave him something no one else ever had, a second chance to become the person he was always meant to be. Lily, once a child without a place, had written her own story in silence and strength, and in doing so, gave them both a future. Not one of perfection, but of belonging. A life that began not with a plan, but with a simple act of kindness, and a necklace made of beads that held the weight of something far greater than gold.